Hello again, traders. This video is part 2 of a series which provides a demonstration of how retail traders can build diversified systematic trend following portfolios using strategy Quant X and Quant Analyzer. Now, previously in part 1 of this video series, we discussed the considerations that we first need to address before we start the workflow process itself. So if you haven't watched it, I strongly recommend that you watch part 1 first. In this episode, we'll be launching straight away into strategy Quant X and providing a detailed overview of the configuration settings we use for our automated workflow processes. So let's get cracking. Before we can commence the workflow process, we firstly need to ensure that strategy Quant X contains the market data that we want to use for our workflow processes. So in part 1 of this video, we defined a 21 market universe of Forex markets that we want to test. So let's check that we have this market data available in the data manager. So here we are in strategy Quant X, and I will now select the data manager from the menu of options. Now let's have a look at that data for our first desired market of AUD/JPY. You will notice that we have 3 separate data files comprising 2 separate data sources, namely data obtained from Ducoscopy and data obtained from a file reference, which in this case is data we have directly downloaded from our Pepperstone broker. You will notice that the Ducoscopy data is available as minute data or M1 data between the 1st of December 2003 to the 11th of November 2020. And our Pepperstone file source data is daily data available from between the 14th of December 1983 to the 12th of November 2020. Now, unlike shorter term trading strategies which are sensitive to any form of data variation, the longer term trend following strategies that we are looking to develop are far less sensitive to data variation. This means that we can use multiple data sources to test our strategies and be confident that any variation in the data sources itself is unlikely to materially affect the outcome. The longer term trades that are developed through our trend following methods have very long holding periods, which in some cases extend multiple years. So the impact of minor variations in the data, such as slippage, varying spread and varying swap, are immaterial to the overall equity curve over time. This insensitivity to the market data gives us an added bonus in this particular workflow process, as it therefore allows us to use multiple sources of broker data to develop our strategies. So for this workflow process, we will be using both Ducoscopy minute data and Pepperstone daily data for our workflow process to generate trading strategies that operate on the daily bar. The fine detail of the minute data from Ducoscopy will be very useful for the initial build process of strategies, given the fidelity and precision of the minute data, which is constructed by SQX into daily bar data. And the very long-range daily data that we have available from our Pepperstone broker will be very useful to test the overall robustness of each strategy developed by our workflow process. So just to demonstrate the non-material variation between the 2 different data sources, the chart above represents the equity curves produced by MetaTrader 4 for the same trend following suite of strategies compiled under AUD/JPY on the daily time frame for both the Ducoscopy minute data and the Pepperstone daily data over the same date horizon. Now, while we can see slight differences between both equity curves, the difference in the context of total overall performance is regarded as immaterial to the overall outcome. So that therefore allows us to confidently proceed and use multiple data sources for our testing processes. So let's get back to the data manager. Now, before we move on to the workflow process itself, we need to ensure that the data we use is configured to the same broker time zone that will be used for live trading. So given that we have two sources of data, one from Ducoscopy and one from Pepperstone, we need to ensure the daily bars constructed for our workflow process by SQX uses the same time zone. In our Forex world, we need to understand that unlike equities markets or futures markets, which are centralized around exchanges, the Forex market is a decentralized market, and as a result, different brokers use different time zones on their servers. This means that the open, high, low and close of the daily bar is configured to the preferred time zone of the broker. As we will be trading these strategies live on our Pepperstone account, we therefore need to synchronize the time zone of the Ducoscopy minute data to the local time zone used by Pepperstone, which is the Universal Time Coordinate, or UTC, of +2 hours, including daylight savings. To synchronize this minute data to UTC +2 or 3, if under daylight savings, we use the clone to time zone function that is made available within the Tools menu of the Data Manager. Once we have applied this data cloning to the data source, whenever we update our source data, the clone data will also be updated with this new data. So, there we have it. Our data manager now contains the data we wish to use for our workflow process. So now that we've got our testing data in order, we can now move on to the custom build function of the workflow. As you can see from this summary listing of custom projects, I already have a number of custom projects pre-configured which I use for a range of different data mining exercises. But for the purposes of this video series, we will only be focusing on two of them, namely the D1 Donchian ADX Breakout custom project, which is a workflow I use to generate breakout strategies for my trend following portfolios, and the D1 Trend Following Various custom project, which is a workflow I use to generate additional trend following models that supplement my breakout models and provide enhanced system diversification benefits. I undertake both workflow processes across my selected universe of 21 Forex markets and then compile a portfolio of 7 trend following solutions for each market. 2 of these 7 trend following solutions are derived from the breakout workflow process, leaving the balance of 5 solutions to be drawn from the alternative trend following workflow process. The end result of the entire process described in this video series will be a portfolio of 147 algorithms comprising a diversified array of both breakout and traditional trend following systems. So now let's start by looking at the configurations of the breakout workflow process first. Now, if you refer to the left-hand menu, you'll see a workflow comprising 7 separate processes. These processes represent a staged incremental stepped solution where algorithms developed in the first step, referred to as the build strategies phase, are then subsequently progressively retested in the 6 additional steps to identify the more robust solutions that have also expressed strong performance during more recent market conditions. So the intent of this entire workflow process is to combine 2 broad objectives into our workflow, namely objectives of robustness and recency. The robustness objective is our first objective, and this is to test for strategy weakness, and we therefore refer to this as the robustness phase of the workflow process. And during this phase, we use a vast array of data sources to rigorously stress test each solution and eliminate those candidates that reflect a risk weakness. So following the robustness phase, we therefore are confident that the solutions that remain in our list have been able to confidently navigate a vast array of different market conditions that we have exposed each strategy to without detrimentally exposing our ultimate portfolio to undue risk. You will note that our testing efforts during this phase do not have a profit intent, but are rather directed towards identifying how well the strategies stack up in performing against a variety of different market conditions. I personally have no opinion about how these strategies are going to perform in the future, as the future is uncertain. But I at least know that I have rigorously tested each strategy under a blistering array of different market conditions, and in all of these historic conditions, the strategies have been able to survive and even prosper. That is about as much information as I can infer from this entire workflow process. But robustness is what we are seeking here. Now, for the second objective of recency, having reduced the possible candidates for portfolio inclusion to only include the most robust performers using the first objective, we then can undertake tests designed to further reduce that selection of robust candidates to those that have also expressed recent outperformance. Now, in terms of the statement of outperformance, I once again do not have an opinion about how these strategies are going to perform in the future, but rather I am seeking an adaptational element within the workflow process. Now, to understand this adaptational element, we need to bear in mind that we undertake this workflow process annually to retire and replace algorithms in our portfolio. Our recency tests use a 5-year look back from the current date to identify those robust performers that also demonstrate strong performance over that last 5-year period. So given that we annually undertake this workflow process, the recency tests progressively roll forward each year to ensure that our trend following models developed by this entire workflow process stay sharp and respond to prevailing trending conditions. Now, in part 1 of this video series, I discussed how trend following conditions have changed over time with the increase in mean reversion and market noise, and these have reshaped the trends of today's market. Having an adaptive element to the workflow process ensures that the nature of adaptive markets are reflected in this process to keep our portfolios sharp and current. Okay, so enough of the broad theory that backs this workflow and onto the details of the actual configuration. So we start by selecting the build strategies phase of this breakout workflow. And we'll then commence with the what to build tab of this part of the workflow process. Now, this build phase of the workflow are where strategies are initially developed prior to their rigorous testing. And I want to store the results of the strategies that pass this phase in a databank. So I have created a databank called results, and I will select that this is where I would like the outputs of this phase stored. Now onto the strategy type. For this specific workflow, I only want to deploy simple breakout strategies that run on a single market and time frame. So I select the default simple strategy option. Now I move down to the additional build configuration settings, as these are very important. For trading directions, I want the strategies to trade both long and short directions and reflect symmetry in their entry and exit conditions if applicable. What this symmetry means is that the entry rules are reversed for long or short trade directions. So let's say our breakout strategy takes a long entry when the open price lies above the highest high. Then a symmetrical rule means that our breakout strategy will take a short entry when the open price lies below the lowest low. Now, in terms of trading long or short, some traders do like to focus on simply either long or short trades. But personally, for me, for added diversification benefits, and particularly when dealing with Forex markets that are directionally neutral, I like to ensure that I can trade both long or short. Okay, so now to the strategy style. I am simply selecting the option SQX signal style. I don't concern myself with the other options for these particular models. Now onto the build mode. I select random generation as opposed to genetic evolution in my workflow, as genetic evolution processes are used to quickly lock on to only those optimal performers and develop variations around those candidates. But for the purposes of trend following workflow processes, I prefer the slower random process, which assists in achieving my diversification objectives and also avoids the possibility of locking onto possible results that possess negative curve fitted symptoms. So random generation it is. Now to the number of conditions. Just to be clear, I am only concerned with entry conditions in my models, as the exit condition is always defined by an ATR-based trailing stop. So in terms of my entry rule, I'm looking for simple entry rules with few conditions as opposed to complex entry rules with many conditions. So I set a range of between 2 to 3 in my entry rules. Fewer rules are preferred to a greater number of rules when you are seeking simple trend following models that have broad market application. By increasing your rules, you are more specific in your entry condition and therefore far more restricted in the market conditions in which your trends following strategy will operate. So keep it simple with few rules to increase your system's robustness. In terms of exit rules, since I don't use them, these settings don't matter. For the global indicators period, I want to use a long-term look back for the entry indicators I use for my entry conditions. So I set the maximum setting for up to a 3000 bar look back. Having such a long look back is only advised for medium to long-term trend following techniques with very long average holds. Remember in part 1 of this video series where we discussed design rules? Well, because we are focusing our attention towards the fat tail of the market distribution of returns and we want to avoid trading the everyday market noise or market churn, we need to extend our indicator lookbacks to extreme values beyond normal day-to-day market activity. So by setting the range between a minimum of 10 and a 3000 bar lookback for your indicators, you therefore open up the workflow to target those strategies that work well within more exotic and extreme environments. Finally, for the global look-back period, or the shift, because I only want to trade on the open of the daily bar for these trend-following models, I therefore want to assess the condition of the indicator based on the immediately preceding bar. Having a shift of 0 means that the entry condition is evaluated on the current bar. Having a shift of 1 means that the entry condition is evaluated on the preceding bar. And 2 means on the preceding second bar, etc., etc. So in all my strategies, I'll simply use a shift of 1. Now onto the stop loss. This is a critical setting as we want to ensure that we embed a stop loss into each of our trend following solutions to meet our design criteria of cutting losses short. But note that while we want to ensure a stop loss is always applied, we also want to only apply an ATR-based stop loss. Having an ATR-based stop loss allows us to use this workflow across multiple markets, as the ATR method of stop loss placement and position sizing allows us to normalize this process to any liquid market. So ATR-based it is, and we want to allow the workflow process to test strategies using ATR periods spanning the last 20 daily bars, using multiples that range between 1.5 times and 5 times. The ATR period itself of 20 does not greatly assist with the diversification, unlike its multiple which does. So we simply set the ATR period to register the last 20 daily bars, and this is sufficient to reflect current volatility. But the span of the ATR multiple between 1.5 times and 5 times provides a degree of diversification in entry condition, allowing us to target both shorter-term momentum impulses using tighter initial stops, as well as longer-term trend movements that provide significant breathing room to develop. So now let's look at the profit target. As we have already discussed in episode 1 of this series, given that we are targeting the fat tails of the distribution of market returns, we do not wish to set a profit target. We simply rely on a trailing stop, which we will shortly be addressing, to exit each strategy. The long-term performance of our trend-following strategy is ultimately determined by our ability to catch some extreme trending moves, which dominate the profit contribution of the total portfolio. So if we apply profit targets to our exits, then we severely compromise this ambition. It is the extreme outlier which is the dominant contributor of our long-term success. And while the temptation may be great to take profit off the table, particularly when we frequently experience times where our unrealized profit disappears in front of our eyes when trends end and conditions become unfavorable, we simply cannot afford to preempt what these fat tails can possibly deliver. So the moral of the story for this particular form of workflow process is don't use profit targets. So that's it for the first tab of the build phase. Now let's move on to the data tab. First, we select the platform that we intend to use these algorithms on in the live trading environment. And in this case, we'll be using MetaTrader 4, that is the common platform used by many retail brokers such as Pepperstone. Then we select the first instrument that we'll be testing in our 21 market Forex universe, in this case AUD JPY, and for the build phase we will be using the M1 clone data that we have previously discussed. Now, as per our design rules discussed in episode 1, we will be trading the daily time frame, and for the purpose of the build function we will be using a fairly extensive data horizon from between the 1st of the 1st 2007 to the most recent month end available, which as at today's date of the 12th of November 2020 is the month end date of the 31st of October 2020. Now, for the purposes of this divergent workflow process, we will not be using an in-sample component or out-of-sample component for our testing, as the method of testing we engage through using design-led logic, combined with extensive multi-market testing, already significantly reduces our chances of deriving a curve-fit result. This is not to say that the use of out-of-sample testing is not recommended for all different types of trading models, but it certainly does apply to our particular divergent processes that we engage here, where the design rules have already significantly reduced the chance of a curve-fit result. So, for this divergent workflow process that seeks to exploit fat-tailed market environments, we do not need to reserve a portion of our valuable market data for out-of-sample testing purposes, and we can therefore utilize the entire sample for development and testing. Now onto the precision of the initial build test. For our first test, we simply apply the selected time frame only, which is a very fast test. This will therefore only build the strategy using the open, high, low and close of the daily bar of that M1 data. This is sufficient for the initial build phase, but we then apply higher precision minute data in the cross-check tab of the build process, which we'll be looking at shortly, to more rigorously test the randomly generated trend following solutions. So the reason we apply this fastest method for the initial phase of the build process is so we can quickly develop a data bank of diversified trend following solutions without using too much PC resources in the process. So that's it for this tab. Now on to the trading options tab. There are numerous settings that can be applied on this tab to change the nature of the trading strategies generated, but for our simple trend following purposes, we simply want to specify a rule that only allows one trade per day per strategy generated by this process. As we are seeking diversified trend following systems for our portfolio, we do not wish to enable any individual strategy to dominate the portfolio result. So by selecting one trade per day per strategy, we therefore restrict our solutions to only allowing one trade at a time. So that's it for the trading options, but time is getting ahead of us and I need to break this process up into digestible segments. So we'll stop here for today and then proceed with the workflow process in a future episode. So remember, for our forum members, you will be supplied with the project configuration files of this video series, so you will be able to quickly take these workflows for a road test yourself using your own broker's data, and we can also collectively enhance these projects together from what has been discussed in this video series through the forum. But until next time folks, thanks for listening and trade well and prosper.